Lovely to be here this morning. And I'd like you to start by listening. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the wonderful sound of a couple of hundred people consciously listening. Not something we do that often, but it's absolutely crucial for any successful organization and also to be successful as an individual. Think about this little fellow. He's very successful out in the wild. And in order to be successful, there are three things that really matter: flexibility, strength, speed. He's good at all of those. There's one more. And you may be good at all of those, but without this extra one, you're missing a huge trick. What is that extra one? Awareness. Do you know there's not a mammal, in fact, there's not a vertebrate on this planet that does not have ears? There's quite a lot that don't have eyes. Ears are universal. It's the primary warning sense for you and for any vertebrate. And just like this fellow, he's listening all the time, listening for danger and listening for opportunity, whether that be food, social, or whatever. Listening is critical. It's a skill which is so underestimated in most organizations, and yet it's the lifeblood which flows through all commerce, through all relationships, whatever they are, whether they're personal or business relationships. Listening is at the root of all of these things. And I imagine that a lot of these things, probably all of these things, matter to you a great deal. You can't learn if you don't listen. Leaders who don't listen are not that effective. Tell, sell, consult, join. You need to be able to move through those modes. And if you don't listen to your people at all, they will stop listening to you. I think we all know this. If you want to sell or persuade people, listening is critical. Any great salesperson will tell you the most important part of a sales conversation: listening. It's not the speaking, it's the listening. That's how you understand people. Building relationships. What's the most common complaint in relationships? I'm going to genderize this one. Normally it's, he never listens to me, isn't it? But it does cut both ways, and we'll come on to that in a short while. And to understand the world, to understand the people around you, to understand yourself, listening is absolutely crucial. There's been a lot of research recently into organizational listening, which is founded in personal listening, of course. But organizational listening has been shown to have some great benefits. Organizations which are well rated for listening, and there aren't many, I can tell you, have all of these green things happening big time for them. They have better morale amongst their employees, better loyalty, less staff turnover. The saving is enormous of that kind of thing, and greater productivity, which again we'll be exploring in a little while. All of those things are boosted by having a listening culture and by listening well. Retaining customers. You know the old adage, it costs, 6 or 10 times as much to find a new customer as to retain an existing one. If you want to retain customers, listen to them. Listen to them. Customers get very fed up if they're not listened to. And finally, your reputation. We live in an age where reputation is critical, isn't it? PR, crises, dealing with crises, listening to customers, listening to complaints, those kind of things enhance your reputation enormously. On the other hand, the organizations which were rated as poor for listening had a lot more crisis. They had a great deal more criticism, and all of those green things were lower for them. Listening pays. Unfortunately, in the world in which we live, the eyes have it. We are in a very, very ocular culture. I describe myself as a sound evangelist most of the time, because sound is very important. You're going to discover that in a moment, and yet really underrated, because we're so focused on how things look. We design for the eyes. We live through our eyes. We communicate with our eyes a lot of the time, and the ears get underrated. A lot of it is because of the new communication paradigms that we've invented over the last 30 or 40 years, most of them text-based, email, instant messaging, social media. A lot of people spend a lot of their time in this posture. I used to go to the TED conference, and one of the greatest things about that conference and I've been many times, was standing in line. Because standing in line, you'd say to somebody next to you, "Hi, what do you do?" And turns out they just interviewed the Dalai Lama and written a book and so forth. Generally, they're very interesting conversations. Now, if you go to TED and stand in line, everybody's doing this. And I think it's tragic, the degree to which this has overtaken our ability to be present and to listen to each other. So that's one thing. There is actually an anomaly here, because speaking is up to 100,000 years old. Complex language developed something like 100,000 years ago, maybe 60, but many people say 100. Whereas writing is relatively recent. Just 4,000 years ago, we invented writing. It's come up on the rails, and it's overtaken speaking. Now, there are reasons for this. Now, I would say these are very important things about speaking. It's fast. There's richness in speaking. You can hear my intonation, my prosody. That puts across emphasis. How many times have you sent an email which has been really badly misinterpreted because of the lack of this additional layer? I'm not saying writing is rubbish. Writing is really crucial. Some of the biggest changes in the world have come about because books have been able to be published and disseminated. Ideas have been pushed out that way. And I know the lawyers among you, writing would be, if you took it away, it would make your life slightly difficult, wouldn't it? It's fixed, it's referable, you can CC it, you can check it, you can edit it. My goodness, how would we be if all contracts in the world were verbal? It'd be a bit of a problem. However, there's a time and a place for both of these things, and I would suggest that writing has assumed too much of a dominant position. Here are the 4 ways we communicate: reading, writing, speaking, listening. I presented them here with equal weight, but that is not the way we treat them in education or in society. It's rather more like this, isn't it? We teach and test reading and writing. It's a scandal if a child leaves school unable to read and write. We do not teach speaking or listening, hardly at all. Listening is a silent skill, very hard to teach, very hard to test, and yet so important. And yet we ignore it. We expect children to pick up this amazing instrument that we all use, the human voice. Just pick it up, just learn by doing. And the result of that is so many people are not using the full power of their voice. Now, that's another talk. Today, we're going to be focusing on the listening side of the equation. Why? Because I think it's the most underestimated. We speak, we listen. You would think they're in balance, like this, 50-50. No, the research shows that in most organizations, 80% of our energy and time is spent speaking. We only spend 20% of our time and energy and focus on listening. I wonder, can I just ask for a show of hands, how many of you have formal training in listening in your organization? 1.5? Okay. Do you see what I mean? We don't focus. If I use the word communication, what does that mean to you? Speaking, outbound, PR, advertising, email, outbound, outbound, outbound. You don't think about listening, and yet communication is a two-way process. The trouble is, we often think of it like this, that we speak and somebody just listens. It's a linear process. No, it is not a linear process. It's actually a circular process. Because the way I speak affects the way you listen, and the way you listen affects the way I speak. It's a circle. And it's a circle that happens within a huge context. Very often, that context is noise or poor acoustics. It's a telephone line where it's difficult to hear. It's a conference call where people are being distorted. There's a lot going against us in our ability to communicate important information. I did a talk on listening some time ago to a very, very well-known firm of lawyers in New York, lawyers and corporate bankers in New York. They had a trading floor. You know what a trading floor looks like, 5 screens, headsets, everybody shouting. Right above that, they'd kitted out the lawyer's floor in exactly the same way. 2 or 3 screens, everybody on headsets, everybody sitting open plan. These people's lives were taking half-hour phone calls from clients who had 5 minutes to describe the issue, and then they would give an opinion. Can you imagine the stress they're under? Not being able to hear properly, noise around them. And if you make a mistake in that phone call, what are the costs in America of incorrect legal advice? No wonder they had massive staff turnover, huge burnout. That was just an inappropriate way to organize that activity in that company. They didn't think about listening or sound. Actually, it's even bigger than that. Listening and speaking affect three things, only three things, but they are quite important things. These three. Your happiness is affected by how well you can communicate, which is outbound and inbound. How well you listen is key. Your effectiveness as a human being, as a manager, as a business person, as a customer service person, very, very powerfully affected by how well you listen and how well you can put your point across. And your well-being as well, which is right at the top of the corporate agenda across the world now. Well-being, you'll find it right up there in all the major American corporations. I'm finding it all the time. Well-being is critical, and that too is affected by your ability to listen, process the sound around you, take responsibility for the sound you make and for the sound you're consuming. But how often do we think about the sound around us? You probably thought this room was silent when you walked in. It's not, is it? There's a lot of machinery going on in here. We often work in environments like this. You probably know the feeling as the air conditioning goes off at 6 p.m., everybody goes, oh, because they've been putting up with a noise that they've blanked, their mind has shut it out for the whole day. And yes, it is stress-inducing. It happens to have an effect on you. And I'm going to go into those in a moment. Now, as I talk through this, I would love for you to have a piece of paper in front of you and write 3 things at the top of it. Would you do that? 3 things? Because I'd like those 3 things to be 3 things you will take away from this talk so that it's not one of those talks that you hear and you go, yeah, that was really interesting, and then it kind of evaporates like a puddle in the sun. These 3 things should start with the words, I will or I will not. These are promises to yourself. You're going to discover a lot in this short talk about sound and how it affects you, how to listen better. I would love you to go home with 3 things that you're going to do or not do as a result of this. Then we make a bit of a difference in the world. All right, listening. I'm going to distinguish 3 kinds of listening. One of them you'll be very familiar with, not necessarily great at, but familiar with. The other 2 you may not have thought about very much at all, or even come across. So I'll start with the unfamiliar ones. Let's start with inner listening. Inner listening. What do I mean by that? Well, many of us have a little voice in our head. It may be quite critical. Now, you're all successful business people, so you probably have less of this than many, or you're used to counteracting it, but we do. God, you're looking fat today when you look in the mirror. Don't you dare go on that dance floor and make a fool of yourself again. You know this kind of negative self-talk? You idiot. I've had that one on the golf course a few times. You know that kind of negative self-talk, critical self-talk? We get that a lot. And many people confuse that with their own voice. I want to give you a very important distinction here. You are not that inner voice. It may be a part of you that got damaged. It may be trying to help, but in a slightly misguided way. But if you're not the voice, who are you? You're the one who's listening to the voice. Now that is a transformational understanding. Because if you get that little voice in your head saying, don't you dare go on that dance floor, you can tousle its head, say, thanks for sharing, I'm going to ignore you this time, and do what you want to do, because you're the one listening, you're not the voice. So perhaps if you have issues with negative self-talk, that may help you to listen to it in a different way. Think of it as a naughty child or something like that coming. Ask yourself, say, that's interesting, which is a very, very useful way of approaching any negative input in your life. Rather than, you idiot, you've messed up again, that's interesting. Why did that happen? How can I learn? And about the voice, you can ask 3 questions. Is that true? Am I an idiot? Is it helpful? Is it kind? If not, perhaps ignore it and carry on. Inner listening. Very important because it actually drives the way you externalize in the world. It can inhibit you, stop you entirely from doing things you'd love to do, for example. So, inner listening. Let's move on to the other slightly esoteric form of listening that you may not have come across before. I call it created listening. What do I mean by created listening? Well, the best way to put this across is to say, whenever you're speaking to anybody, you always speak into a listening. Now, we'll come on to why it is that all of you in this room have unique listenings that you have brought into this room. And as you're all sitting together, there's a compound. There's a listening for me in this room. Part of that will be your expectations, what you know. If you've ever met me before, it'll be what I've done in the past or the way I've affected your life. Maybe you've seen a TED Talk, I don't know. You might have an expectation, you'd be listening and thinking, oh, this should be interesting, or I think this guy's terrible, I'm going to sleep. You know, that can change your listening. But also you've got a lot of other stuff you bring to the room. So it's a compound listening that we co-create. I am right now speaking into a listening. This is crucial, ladies and gentlemen, for powerful communication. Because the listenings change, and it is a grave and common mistake I come across so often to think everybody listens like I do, I'm just going to speak the same way to everybody. Don't do that. Don't do that. Everybody's different. How do you get round this? You ask a simple question. What's the listening? Ask yourself, one-to-one, with your family, with a group of colleagues, on a stage, presenting to people, what's the listening? And just by asking that question over and over again, I promise you, you will get good at just intuiting, spotting the listening and understanding how to change. If this were a room of 70-year-olds, for example, and it's after lunch, I would have to change my game somewhat, wouldn't I? You've all probably had to stand on a stage after lunch when people are tired, and you can tell the listening because people are starting to look a little bit like this, or they're sitting like this. Head supporting is a very bad sign in an audience, and I'm glad to say I can see none of it going on out there. A couple of people just went like this. So you get to feel, leaning back, slouching, eyes half closing, expressions of distaste. You can feel it. It's micro-language. You can feel it one-to-one. You can feel it in a group. Ask what's the listening everywhere, all the time, and you will get good at this, and your speaking will be turbocharged in its effectiveness because you'll be speaking into the right listening, hitting the bullseye instead of missing the target altogether. So, two kinds of listening you may not have thought about. And by the way, this is important too for reputation. I don't know if any of you have seen this guy, Gerald Ratner. Now, some years ago, he was the head of the go-to jewelry company in the UK. Ratner's was where everybody went for engagement rings or for jewelry or whatever. It's on every high street. It was enormous. It had the market sewn up. He went to the Institute of Directors and gave a speech in the Albert Hall. And in that speech, he made some self-deprecating jokes. He said, the reason our stuff is so inexpensive is because it's crap. He said, our earrings are as cheap as a prawn sandwich, but they won't last as long. He was joking. But the next day, the people don't like being disrespected. Your customers wouldn't like it if you disrespected them in that way. The papers went mad. £500 million was knocked off the value of Ratner's. He had to resign. The company barely survived and relaunched itself as the Signet Group, which it now is. It's a fraction of its former size. That is what you can do to change the listening for your business for the worse. Be careful what you say. So, let's move on to the more traditional form of listening, outer listening, listening to sound around us. Outer listening is the most common kind of listening that we would think about, and yet, again, I would say we don't think about it very much at all. Some people do. I love this quote from Ernest Hemingway. I think he's absolutely right. If you can listen well, you have an advantage over 99% of your competitors, because they're not. I can guarantee to you. Let's go right back to the beginning. So this is right at the beginning. The first sound you ever heard was your mother's heartbeat, which is a 3-beat, incidentally. Lub, dub, pause, lub, dub, pause, lub, dub, pause. It's a waltz, which is probably why there's not a lot of aggressive music in 3-time. It's a very comforting rhythm, that 3-time. Very loud. You heard that very loud whilst you were inside your mother's. And then the world changed as you came out. All the high frequencies were revealed, which is probably why most babies scream. And you are now listening largely through these things. These funny-shaped flaps on the sides of your head, the pinna, and inside a miracle of engineering. 3 tiny little bones that vibrate thousands of times a second from the moment you're inside your mother and you start hearing to the moment you die. It's your primary warning sense. You hear a sphere all around you. You see a cone. I can close my eyes at any time. You may have noticed you have no earlids. You're listening even while you're asleep. A strange sound in your house will wake you up 9 times out of 10. It's very deep, very fast, and it affects you profoundly. And I'm going to go through the ways in which sound affects you. There are 4 of them. Let's start with the first. So a little wake-up call. If your alarm clock sounds like that at home, please change it. It's not good for you waking up to a sudden sound like that, because that gives you a shot of cortisol, your fight-flight hormone. I've just done that to you in quite a mild way. So your heart rate would have elevated a little bit, your breathing changed, chemicals entered your bloodstream, making you ready to fight or flee. I can calm you down again by deploying a little bit of this. Gentle surf. Anybody had trouble sleeping? This is a great sound to use. It's a similar cadence to the breathing of a sleeping human being, a sound we associate with not having a care in the world, being on a beach, and so forth and so on. The next way sound affects us is with our feelings. Psychologically, sound changes our emotions. When this piece of music is not going to make you feel happy, is it? It wasn't designed to make you feel happy. Music conveys emotion incredibly powerfully and well. Not the only sound that changes our feelings. At my company, the sound agency, we deploy birdsong like this in many locations, because birdsong is a sound most people find reassuring and calming. We've learned over hundreds of thousands of years, when the birds are singing like this, things are normally fine. It's only if they suddenly stop for any reason, that's not a good feeling, is it? Normally means something bad is on its way. So birdsong is a very productive and happy sound. Sounds affecting your body and your feelings. Third way sound affects you, cognitively. You can't understand 2 people talking at the same time, or in this case, 1 person talking twice. You can't, can you? We have bandwidth for around 1.6 human conversations at a time. Now that's why people who have to work in offices that sound like this struggle quite a lot, especially if you can hear 1 person talking next to you about their great night out. We've already said you have no earlids. You can't shut it out. You're programmed to decode language, and it takes up 1 of your 1.6. You're left with 0.6 for the little voice in your head that's trying to help you write that article or that contract or do those numbers. You know how difficult... Can you shut up? I'm trying to work. You know that feeling? And that is why open plan offices are not a great move. Now, I did a BBC radio documentary recently called The Curse of Open Plan, which is on Radio 4's website if you want to have a listen to it. Open plan is not all bad. There are times and places for open plan to be great, but that time and that place is not solo working. And yet, unfortunately, most architects and interior designers now seem to be of the opinion that open plan is the only kind of office that we all need. It isn't. Actually, we need 4 kinds of office space, ladies and gentlemen. And this is in collaboration with the work of some excellent academics in the UK. 4 kinds of working, different kind of working space for each. Collaboration, open plan, great. If it's okay to shout across the office and you want to hear what's going on and have informal groups and be calling across and everybody's working together, open plan is tremendous. Love it. It is rubbish for concentration. That's where we need quiet working space, which is sadly undersupplied in most companies. People go and camp in a boardroom, work from home, put headphones on. You know how it goes. The third kind of space that we need is space for contemplation, decompression. After a big call, a big meeting, you might want to just chill, or you might want something social, like a cafe space where you can do something completely different. It's a different kind of space, a non-working space almost. And finally, space for communication. I have been in offices, ladies and gentlemen, where the turning of a piece of paper is a major event. They're so quiet. Now, if you're in that kind of space and one person takes a phone call, "Oh, hello, Mum. Can I call you back? Because I've got 20 people listening to me right now, and they can all hear exactly what I'm saying." You know that syndrome? It's embarrassing for the person taking the call. And when I take that call, how many people am I putting off from their work? Everyone. Communication needs to be thought about so that people can make and receive calls in a space that's conducive to that. The fourth way sound affects us, the final way, is behavioral. Absolutely crucial. So is this person going to drive at a steady 28 miles per hour? I doubt it. This kind of music has an effect on people's behavior. Many kinds of music or many different types of sound will. At the simplest, we will move away from unpleasant sound if we can. So if I were to put this sound on and leave it for the next half hour or so, I don't think you'd be in here. You would all go and have a cup of coffee. The guy's nuts. I'm not listening to that. We will move away from that if we can. And that's why sound has a profound effect. Let me give you a little case study of the way sound can affect your behavior in retail situations, which is a lot of the work we do at the Sound Agency. There was a study done by some academics in a supermarket. 2 gondola ends, French wine, German wine. No difference visually between them at all. Exactly the same. All they did was alternate a music condition. So on day 1, a little bit of this. And on day 2, wait for it. Sorry to any Germans in the audience. I know that's not your favorite music necessarily. Well, it might be, of course. So what happened? What happened? On the French music days, French wine outsold German wine by 5 bottles to 1, which may not be of a huge surprise. I mean, it does tend to sell more in the world market. But on the German music days, German wine outsold French wine 2 bottles to 1. Now, that is a massive shift in behavior, and I can guarantee it's not conscious. It wasn't, German music, therefore I should buy German wine. It doesn't work like that. So it's completely unconscious level. The music was playing, people bought the German wine. That is how powerful sound can be in affecting your behavior all the way through the day, and your body, and your feelings, and your cognition. It matters. Matters to retailers. This is something we are addressing around the world, and they're starting to understand if they make terrible noise, people leave. Just like if you had a shop that had a terrible smell in it, you wouldn't go in. Same thing, except you don't notice so much with noise. Let's come back to listening. You spend potentially up to 60% of your time listening, depending on what your job is, and yet, on average, we retain just 1 word in 4, 25% of what we hear. Now, obviously not this talk. You're going to remember every word I've said. However, that is the average, 25%. That's not tremendous, is it? And the thing is that listening is a skill. We take it as something we just do, like hearing. Hearing and listening are not the same. You hear everything, it's automatic. Listening is a process of selecting some things and then making meaning from them. It's a dying skill, and it's a skill you can develop. So, to be formal, my definition for listening is making meaning from sound. It's a mental process, not physical, not electronic, or electrical rather. It's a mental process. And if you're not doing it consciously, if you're not aware that you're doing it, you're missing a trick. Now, I said earlier that your listening is unique. It is absolutely unique. You've come a different road to this room here today, all of you, different individual roads. Why is your listening unique? Because you listen through a set of filters, and here they are. These filters are on all the time, and you're probably not aware of them. You're born into a culture. You speak a language. That changes your listening. Some languages don't have words for certain things. Others do. You have values, attitudes, beliefs. that you accrete along the way from your parents, from teachers, from role models, from friends. And you take the ones that you like and you leave aside the ones that you don't like. You may make assumptions about the way the world works or the way people work, which can fundamentally change the way you listen. You might have expectations, intentions, and even emotions going on, which can affect the way you listen right here, right now. Your listening changes over time, and every person in this room has got a specific, unique listening right now. Put that together, and of course that creates your reality. Because you're selecting different things and responding in different ways to the same auditory input, me speaking, as the people around you. There may be similarities, but there will also be differences. Now, those differences are important. I'll just play a little bit of fun game with you because the senses interrelate. So I want to talk for just a moment about cross-modal effects. It's very bad in design or in thinking about branding, for example, to ignore any of the senses. You need to think about all of them together because they affect one another. And here is how sight can affect sound. I'd like you to look at the screen, those of you who can see a screen, look at the screen and listen to what this guy is saying. Ba, 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 ba. Now you're probably hearing da-da. Ba, 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 ba. Now close your eyes and listen to him. Ba, 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 ba. He's actually saying ba-ba. On the video, he's saying ga-ga. So your eyes see gaga, your ears hear ba-ba, and your brain goes, that's da-da. If you look back at the screen, even though you know he's saying ba-ba, you will hear da-da again. It's called the McGurk illusion. It works for about 90% of people. Now, there is a problem with listening, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. The problem with listening is that we're losing it. Not only do we not think about it, or probably because we don't think about it, we're losing our listening in the modern world for a lot of reasons. We've invented ways of recording things. First writing, then audio recording, then video recording. So, you know, if you're feeling sleepy, I can probably catch his TED Talk later on YouTube or something. It's not as critical anymore. Once upon a time, you sat at the feet of your teacher, and if you missed it, you missed it. There was no way to record it. Now, the premium on careful listening is far, far lower. I'll check his book. He'll be all right, you know. We are impatient as well. I love this cartoon, and so true these days in politics, isn't it? Oratory has disappeared. The art of rhetoric, standing up and making a reasoned argument with a long speech, that used to be the way politics worked, not anymore. You get 30 seconds if you're lucky. Sound bites are the rule. Management and government in 140 characters, not my favorite thing in the world. Not a lot of listening in that. And then we have the media and our, I would say, rather unhealthy relationship with the media. These are some of the red top headlines, red tops being the popular press in the UK, and these are the words they use all the time. For example, I don't think anybody can be mildly upset in the UK anymore. It's always fury. Such and such fury at. Now, when we debase language like this, we make it extreme, polar, coarse, unsubtle. We lose the quietness, the stillness, the grey area in between, the subtlety. It's a shame. And all of these are the ways in which the journalists tend to, and we actually tend to stoke this fire. Editorializing instead of reporting, that's so common now. Attack journalism, where you let somebody talk for 10 seconds and then dive in and interrupt with an aggressive question, interrupting itself, which is an epidemic. Cockfighting, where you get two people who are obviously going to disagree and just chuck them in and have them fight in front of everybody in order to have a bit of fun and a bit of extreme aggression. Or blame throwing. Whose fault? Who can we blame for this? Somebody must be to blame. Who's the guilty party? We want to find out who it is. That's because we are all somewhat addicted now to outrage. And I'll come back to why that is shortly. Headphones. I'm sure lots of you have headphones. If you can hear this noise from somebody's headphones, they're killing their hearing. If you're going to use headphones, please buy the best ones you possibly can, because the temptation with not so good headphones is turn them up, turn them up, turn them up, and you kill your hearing. In fact, that's an epidemic too. 1 in 6 American college students is suffering from a thing called noise-induced hearing loss as a result of headphone abuse. Hours of loud sound going deep into the ear canals a day, by the time they're 40 or 50, they will probably be profoundly deaf, or at least extremely challenged and hard of hearing. We may be raising a whole deaf generation because of this kind of abuse. And of course, headphones have another effect, which is they take a big open social space and they turn it into lots of little individual bubbles. When everybody's wearing headphones on a train, nobody's listening to anybody, are they? We're just creating the soundtrack of our own lives. And indeed, the research shows a lot of the reason for headphones is to shut out the noise of other people. Then we've got technology. Now, I'm sure none of you have ever sent this text message. I hope none of you have ever received it. Your children may have. It does get sent. It does get received. Where's the listening in this? That's not a conversation, is it? Technology is fostering what I call personal broadcasting, especially things like Twitter. I'm on a train. Who cares? Really? You know? We have this fascination with these things, and everybody's out there listening to my every move. No, I'm sorry, they are not. That's personal broadcasting. It's the send of communication, not the listening. If you're interested in this argument, there's a great book I can recommend by MIT professor and fellow TED talker Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, which is exactly about how technology is driving us apart, not bringing us together. Now, I want to give you a couple of habits which you may know somebody very well who indulges in these things. You may not. They may be sitting in your seat. They may not. A couple of habits which you need to watch out for in communication. 5 stumbling blocks to communication, and then I'm going to finish with 7 practices you can take away and a word on how to create a listening organization. All in the next 10 minutes. Wonderful. The first habit, looking good. We all like to look good, don't we? But if you start to communicate in that way, if it's about looking good, you get into things like competitive speaking. I'm going to Greece on holiday this year. Oh yeah, I've been to Greece 6 times. Oh. You know, that's a joy kill. Having to trump everybody else, or I'm sorry to use that word, having to beat everybody else in competitive speaking. Or the words, I know. If you know everything, what do you learn? Have you met people who are I know people? I know, professionally unimpressed. Never learn anything? That's not a productive way to be in conversation. And speech writing, of course, which is, while this inconvenient noise is going on in front of me, I'm composing my next brilliant piece of dialogue. That is not listening, ladies and gentlemen. That is speech writing, and it's a very common form of faux listening. And if there's one thing we like more than looking good, what is it? It's being right. Oh, we love being right. And the best way to be right, of course, is to make somebody else wrong, which is where that whole outrage addiction thing in the media comes from. Because if we can be angry that people are wrong, it makes us right, and we feel better about ourselves. And being right tends to create things like interrupting. There's a great phrase from the American author Harville Hendricks. He said, you can either be right or be married. But you can't cuddle up with being right at the end of the day. Being right is slightly addictive, and it can cause a huge amount of conflict in conversation. So those are the 2 habits. I do urge you to have a look at those and just ask, do I do these things? Do I care about how I look when I'm communicating? If you're on a stage, for example, very important to understand, it's not about you. It's about the gift you're giving to the other people. This is about you. It's not about me. Whereas if you see people on stage where it's all about them, you can start to realize that's a bit of a performance. You know, this is all showmanship and designed to impress. I've seen TED Talks like that, and they don't go down very well. Okay, 5 things that are stumbling blocks to powerful communication. They may happen in your firms. They may happen in your house. They form the word agents, so nice and easy to remember. Here they are: assumptions, generalisations, emotions, noise, time, and semantics. I will very briefly go through each of them at a canter. Assumptions. Now, I talked earlier about assumptions about the way the world works. 2 people. One has had a tough life and thinks that people think I'm weak and useless. Another one has had a lovely time and thinks people are lovely and helpful. They walk into a hotel one after the other. The bell person says, "Can I help you with the bag?" The first person says, "No, thank you, I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own bag." I've talked to bell people in hotels, and they do have this reaction quite regularly. The second person walks in, oh, thank you very much, that's very kind of you. Same input, completely different listening. Do you see? So your assumptions change the way that you listen to what goes on around you. Generalisations, great quote here from Agatha Christie, which of course is a generalisation, and therefore to be taken with a pinch of salt. Try to avoid generalisations, especially the maximisers. I'll give you a great exercise on this. Try it for an hour. Try it for a day. A week is challenging. Say exactly what you mean, specifically, without the generalisations. The maximisers, of course, are the words like always, never. You always do that. You never do this properly. Never, really? Not in the history of humanity? Those kind of generalizations are particularly inflammatory. Emotions tend to be inversely related to listening, I find. If you've got somebody upset in front of you, the best way to calm them down is to listen to them and reflect back what they're saying. And you will see the heat come out of the conversation. On the other hand, if you're feeling really upset, it's quite hard to listen to somebody, isn't it? Because you've got stuff going on. I think there's this inverse relationship between those two things. So emotions affect how well we can listen. Noise affects how well we can listen all the time. And a quick tip, if you're working in a place like this and you're trying to think and you can't listen, maybe you're trying to have a conversation, get an MBA. The M, move yourself. So often we don't. I see people standing by people drilling, having a shouted conversation, and I think, why don't you just move? But we don't. We just go on shouting. So be aware of the sound around you. Move yourself if you're in an adverse sound condition. If you can't move it, block it. That means wearing headphones with something productive, and I'll give you some suggestions in a moment on the headphones so you block out the noise. If you can't move and you can't block it, there's only one thing to do, that's accept it. Because the productivity loss is going to come from being upset. And if you say to yourself, okay, I can't move, I can't block this, I've just got to do my best, I'll do my best. Then you take away a big chunk of the productivity loss, which is I can't stand this, how come I have to, all the outrage and upset goes. MBA. And I said I'd suggest 3 sounds to play, which are productive sounds if you want to use headphones. Can you guess what WWB stand for? Wind, water, birdsong. All 3 have been shown to be health-giving, productive sounds. Research is backing this up now. The sounds of gentle water and birdsong actually are good for people. They help people to recover from lots of different illnesses, and there's a lot more research being done on that right now. Time. Listening takes time, ladies and gentlemen. You generously are giving me a lot of your time here. How often is it that you're trying to talk to somebody and it's very difficult. If you want to have a conversation with somebody, very important to set a parameter for time. How long do you have? Do you have 5 minutes for this? Can you give me half an hour? Just check in. This meeting is an hour, yes? So you actually contract the time. So often we don't contract the end of a meeting. We'll start the meeting at 1. How long is it? Some people think 10 minutes. Some people think an hour. We never set the end of meetings, or very rarely. Try to do that. And finally, semantics. Denotation is what a word actually means. Dog, a 4-legged mammal, with teeth and all the rest of it. That's a dog, yes? Connotation is what we make it mean. There was a great advertising campaign by O2 recently, and the slogan of it was, be more dog. By which they mean be more bouncy and happy and enthusiastic and try things, not like cats. So that's what they were trying to put across. And of course, whatever denotation and connotation, these things happen in a context as well. So there are many different nationalities, and I'm very grateful to you all for listening to me in English. Some of you are simultaneously translating. It's amazing that you're doing that, and it creates potential stumbling blocks because you may misunderstand some of the words I'm using or not have come across them. And you always have to be careful to speak clearly and precisely, especially in multicultural or multilingual groups. So, 7 exercises to finish with. The first is silence. Try to get 3 minutes of silence into your day, once or twice. Go and lock yourself in a quiet room, a toilet, doesn't matter. Just reset your ears and then you can listen afresh again. We're so assailed with noise, we forget our relationship with silence. Second, an exercise I call the mixer. Next time you're in a place that sounds like this, ask yourself, how many individual sounds am I listening to? Like tracks on a mixing desk. How many individual sounds am I listening to? Or you could do it in a beautiful place like this. Where are the birds? How many birds can I hear all around me? It's not just a mush, and this exercise really improves the quality of your listening. So try that one. Then we have savouring, like this fellow is with his cup of coffee, listening carefully to the sounds around us, which allows us to distinguish bad ones from good ones. And that is important. You might be surprised by a sound like this. Well, that's really rather beautiful. And yet you hear it every day and you don't think twice about it. So it's worth unlocking the hidden choir in some of the sounds around you. Fourth, we have listening from, positions to listen from. There are many. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Active listening, which is where you say, what I hear you say is, and then you repeat exactly what the person said. Very powerful with an upset customer, but don't do it all the time. You wouldn't have many friends if that's your response to everything people say to you. However, once or twice, with somebody who's upset is very, very strong indeed. Passive listening, like a Zen master by a stream, just hearing, just listening, relating to the sound, but no interpretation going on. Critical listening, that is what you've been doing to me ever since I stepped onto this stage. The little voice in your head, I didn't know you. Where did you get that from? That's interesting, I didn't know that. That little voice, the little voice that just said, what little voice is he talking about? That little voice is in there all the time, and it's your critical listening. Very, very important in business, but not all the time. If somebody comes to you asking for time off for bereavement, you don't want to be marking them out of 10 in how well they're doing this. You need to move to empathic listening. Empathic listening is going onto their island, feeling their feelings, and listening with a lot more than just your ears. Then we've got, this is a bit of a gender stereotype, I admit, but I think there's enough in it from the feedback I've had over the years that it's worthwhile. Men, not all the time, but men, tend to listen in a way I call reductive, which is to say, for a point, to solve a problem, to get to a destination. So he's saying, I've got this problem. He says, here's the solution. He says, thanks. That's a male conversation. Quite simple. Doesn't take very long. Happens all the time. Women, on the other hand, not all women, not all the time, but there's enough truth in this, women tend to listen in a way I call expansive listening. Now, in expansive listening, there is no point. It's not about reaching a destination. It's not about solving something. It's about going with the flow, being with the person, exploring the journey, having fun along the way, smelling the roses. So she comes home and says, I've had this dreadful day. This happened, this happened, this happened. He looks up from the football and says, have a hot bath. Always makes you feel better. Now, in the male world, that's job done, problem solved, back to the football. Whereas in the female world, that was not quite what she was looking for. She was hoping for something more along the line, oh, you poor thing, sit down, have a glass of wine, tell me all about it. That is where the phrase, he never listens to me, comes from largely. If you can get good at moving between these listening positions, you can transform relationships with people. Okay, the fifth exercise I commend to you is listening with. Listening with what? First of all, your ears. Listening with your ears, giving somebody time and attention. Secondly, listening with your eyes. Looking at the person. I am listening to you. No, I'm sorry, that is not listening. That's doing something else. And thirdly, listening with your heart. Now, you can do exercises with this. There are exercises that are available on doing this, and it's amazing how if you move through these, the listening changes and the speaking changes. Number 6, listening for. Tom. Is Tom here?
Yeah.
I'm going to run a little over. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, it's fine. No worries.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to run a little over. Are you okay with that? I'm really sorry, I got carried away at the beginning, but I do want to finish this important part. So, listening for, like this minor, asking yourself, what am I listening for? It might be listening for this crucial opportunity. It might be listening for what's this person upset about. It might be any number of things, but if you ask the question, then you can really mine in the right direction, and there's an objective there. And number 7 is an exercise I call rasa, which is the Sanskrit word for juice. In this context, it stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. A very powerful thing to do when you're in communication with people. Receive means look at them, give body language that is affirmative and engaged, nodding, leaning forward, facial expressions that are positive. Receive. Appreciate. More of the same with the little noises we make in conversation. Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know. Oh, yeah. Those kind of little noises. Summarize, the word so. If you don't have a so person in a meeting, I'm sure you all have experienced this. It can be a very long meeting. The so person will go, so, we've all agreed on this. Now we can move on to that. Summarizing chunks, closing doors in the long corridor of a meeting behind you. Very, very important process. If you don't have a so person, the meeting can go round and round. What's it they say about meetings? Meetings are places where you take minutes and waste hours. They can be like that if you don't have a so person. And finally, ask questions all the way through and at the end to show that you've been paying attention and that you're engaged. Rasa. So, 4 C's of effective listening, ladies and gentlemen. Conscious. Now, I said, if you're not thinking, I'm listening, if you're not conscious that you're doing something, you're missing a trick. Listening is a skill, it's an activity, it's not something that's just passive and happens in the background, or you're missing out. Committed. Set yourself a goal to become a better listener, day by day. Read up on it. Practice. Work at it. It's a skill. You can improve it. Compassionate. The best kind of listening is a listening that actually attempts to understand the other person and suspends judgment and criticism and ideas that are fixed, dogma, and so forth. And finally, the best possible part of listening, the best state to be in for listening, curious. I did some work with a guy once who talked about being ferociously curious, and I think that's a wonderful phrase. What's this all about? What can I learn here? It's a wonderful way to be in life, curious. Now, you all run organizations, and I want to spend just the last 2 minutes talking about how to create a listening organization. And the first and most important step in doing that, of course, is to listen yourselves. Telling people to listen doesn't work very well. Showing people how to listen works much better. Then you can engage them. So it's inspiring people, not ordering them. Who do we listen to? Well, here are some of the key groups that I would suggest. Your employees, your customers, your business partners and suppliers, your stakeholders, whoever they may be, and experts that you need to learn from. Not necessarily exhaustive, but I would suggest those are some of the important people that you want to be listening to. What does it take to create a listening organization? First of all, your commitment and your leadership. This is not something you can issue tomorrow, we're all going to listen better. Memo. No, that does not work. It has to come from you, and it has to be disseminated down with commitment. And that means driving it through the culture. I imagine many of you have got corporate cultures. That's probably something written down. There's also behavior, which may or may not be the same thing. I've worked for companies where there's culture, and then there's behavior. Totally different. So you need to think about both of those. Are we a listening organization? How can we improve the way we listen? Do people interrupt? Do people talk over other people? Does one person dominate a meeting and everybody else stay quiet? Do we have a fear culture where people won't give bad news because they're frightened of the reaction? These kind of questions. Spaces, your offices. Is there noise? Can they speak? Can they listen? Can they understand each other? Bless you, sir. Can they understand each other? Do we create environments where listening can take place? Training. So if we're serious about this, we train people. And we have accountability for training results, for the way people improve. We measure it, we track it. We do appraisals. Many of you will probably do 360 appraisals in your firms. If you're not, it's great practice. And in the appraisal, how well does he or she listen? Upwards, downwards, sideways. I wonder how many of you have got listening questions. How many of you have got appraisals in your company? Hands up. I mean, I'm expecting almost all of you. And how many of you have listening questions in those appraisals? 2, 3, 4. Okay. So there's work to do there if you're serious about being a listening organization, and reward it. Great listeners get promoted, great listeners get pay rises, great listeners are shown to be successful people in the organization. The benefits, your sales go up. Your customer service is excellent. You've seen that at the beginning from the research. You can listen for opportunities. You will seize more opportunities. You'll be more aware of them. And you'll have less of the negative stuff, less crisis and complaint. You'll deal with them better. You'll be more aware of threats in your market as they come up because you're being aware and listening. And most of all, ladies and gentlemen, the gold here is the ideas of your people. Ideas. There's so many of them locked into those people. And if the culture is one of listening, you can unlock them and they will flow. And they'll feel involved, passionate, and they'll do a better job. Now, don't panic. There is help. You can get online tests and tools. There's a thing called the International Listening Association. You might like to check that out. It might be one of your 3 things. You could join it. You can get resources from them. It's very, very good. And there are external courses and trainers that you can bring in to improve your listening. And I would also modestly say there's quite a good book which you could entertain yourself with, which is the one I wrote about speaking and listening. Now, I'm closing. After the break, which is going to happen in a moment, you're going to come back and do your networking. And this is the question which you're going to be considering. Does your firm have a listening culture? And what processes do you have in place to listen to members of your team? Can you provide any examples of how this has influenced firm policies or management? So start thinking about that one, and you can have a healthy discussion about that. Let me leave you just by saying, if we had a world, ladies and gentlemen, where people were speaking consciously to people who were listening consciously, there would be only one result, and that result would be understanding. And whether you think about life at home, global politics, or the way your firm works, that, ladies and gentlemen, is a good and powerful thing because it affects everybody's happiness, effectiveness, and well-being. So I'd like to say thank you very much. By the way, I have at the back there I don't like selling from stage, but if you're interested in this, we have a little pile of my books over there, which we'd be delighted to sign if you want to buy one. You can either do it by going to this URL on your mobile device and just show us the receipt, or you can come back and Jane and I will be there and you can pay with a card at the desk, and I'd be delighted to sign your book personally to you. So I'll be there throughout the break, if that's interesting to you. For those of you who do, and for those of you who don't, I hope you've been interested, entertained. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've got 3 things to take home with you. Most of all, I would like to thank you for lending me your ears today. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.